I have to admit, being in the marketing industry, it's kind of hard to make product liability reform and ballot initiative reform sound really sexy, but that's where we're going. But I can say that being in the advertising industry, there is a lot of money that comes with these ballot initiatives, so that's a really important topic. In fact, over 34 ballot initiatives were submitted in 2022, of which only 4 qualified to gather signatures, and then just 2 gathered enough necessary signatures to appear on the 2022 general election ballot. So we're going to bring forth a couple of experts to tell you more about this. Another chamber priority for the 2023 legislative session is ballot initiative reform. So here to break it down is going to be Paul Hupfa from MDU Resources. And I will now welcome Paul to the stage.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm very pleased today to announce, I introduced 2 of the folks with us here to speak about ballot initiative reform and share their insights and expertise with us. To my right first, Jesse Luther. Jesse's an attorney and principal at the Taylor Luther Group. And next to Jesse is Mark Truax. Mark is the president of PacWest Strategies. He's out of Denver. So we've got a number of questions that we're just going to go back and forth this afternoon with. And Jesse, I'm going to start with you. By all means, if Mark, if you have something to add, jump in, and Jesse likewise on Mark's questions. But just to kind of level set the room, what is a ballot initiative, and how do you qualify to get one on the ballot?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I guess to start off with, I will apologize and beg your indulgence. I am just finishing up the tail end of a cold, and so I've got some candy in my mouth, and if I start coughing, one of these guys promised to talk over me. So thanks, everybody, for coming today. To Paul's question, ballot initiatives are guaranteed in the Montana Constitution. It gives the citizens an opportunity to amend either statutory law or the Montana Constitution by going through this ballot initiative process. And the process involves submitting your measure or your idea to the Montana Secretary of State. It is then reviewed by Legislative Services Division, the Montana Secretary of State, and the Montana Attorney General. And if you make it all the way through that review process, then you're approved for signature gathering. And there are certain thresholds you have to meet on getting signatures from registered Montana electors. So if you're trying to amend the Constitution, you need 10% of registered electors in each of 40 legislative House districts. And if you're looking at a statutory initiative, you need 5% of the registered electors in each of 34 legislative House districts. So you have to go through this process to get the signatures. If you meet those requirements, if those signatures are certified, then your initiative can be placed on the ballot. It goes to the general populace to vote on, and folks get to vote either yes or no. And if you get 50% or 50.1%, your initiative passes and becomes law. So that's just at a very, very high level, so we're kind of all singing off the same sheet of music.
Perfect, thank you. Mark, we had talked last week a little bit about this, and you had some insights that we thought were pretty interesting. Is it really that easy to qualify for a ballot initiative in Montana?
Well, yes and no, and Jesse can speak to this as well. First, let me say thank you. It's great to be here, and Courtney and Todd, thank you for having me up from Denver. It is great to be back in Montana with a lot of familiar faces and friends, and a Happy New Year. Qualifying in Montana, and Jesse can jump into this as well. It's not super easy. There are some difficulties and there are some hurdles. But I would compare it and look at the rest of the country. And I do ballot measure work all over the United States, and it's predominantly a Western U.S. thing based on the way the constitutions were written and the states came about. And I'll save you the state constitution lesson for another time at the bar this evening. But really looking at it, the best thing that Montana has is that it's in the middle of the pack on the deadline. And signature collection is a national commodity, just as oil, coal, wheat, cattle, anything like that. When you're looking at it, it is a national commodity. And when you're looking at Colorado, that had 151 ballot initiatives introduced last year, 13 of them made it to the ballot. In 2020, we had 247 initiatives proposed and that they were looking at and making their way to the ballot. When you're going out for signature collection, that's the biggest thing. And in Montana, they're due at the end of June. Signatures are due at the end of June. There are other states out there collecting at that time as well. So if Arizona, it's called having dollars on the board. If they got more on the board in Arizona, Missouri, California, or Colorado at the time that are still out for collection, the big signature collectors are going to be out in those states. They're not going to be here in Montana. They're not going to be working through that. And the second part, as Jesse mentioned to it, is your geographical distribution requirement. And if you don't hit that 40 threshold or that 34 district threshold, and you come in at 33 or you come in at 39, all your work is for naught. And not every state has that. And so there are some difficulties to it. Given the population size, your thresholds aren't as high, so you don't have the sheer raw numbers that you have to get. But there's some administrative hurdles that you've got to go through, and if you're not paying attention, you can trip yourself up, waste a lot of time and resources and dollars just over an administrative process.
And I'll jump in too. I mean, I think there is a bit of a perception, and perception is always sometimes reality, that Montana is easy to qualify something because if you're well-funded enough and organized enough, the costs to qualify something in Montana are just so much less expensive than they are in these other states that have much higher populations that you have to go out and collect signatures from, et cetera. So I think it's a little bit of both, I would say.
Yeah. The other thing to look at that's happened over the last several years is the impact on COVID. That we've seen, the 2020 election and the 2022 election. And 2020 was COVID. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We had no idea, where things were. It was, a couple weeks to flatten the curve, and we all remember that, and here we are 3 years later. But with that, signatures were due in June. They're due in July in Arizona and Missouri. They're due in August in Colorado. People didn't want to go door to door. They didn't want to sign things. They didn't want to use someone else's ink pen to sign a petition. So it was incredibly difficult in 2020 to get things on the ballot. In 2022, it was also COVID, but for a completely different reason. It was a workforce issue. And paid signature collection around the country and ballot initiatives around the country. And the same with candidates. And if you go down the street here and ask your elected officials that were having to run in 2022 and needed to petition onto the ballot, they probably will tell you that it was a little more expensive than it had been previously. Because getting those signature collectors, it's hard work. You're out, you're knocking on doors, you're having to talk to people, and you're wanting to get them to communicate and sign your petition, whether it's to become a candidate or to get something on the ballot. We were seeing upwards of anywhere between $25 and $35 per signature toward the end there. That is stupid money for signature collection. I would have less stress and make more money if I quit my job and actually went and did signature collections than I would if I actually went and ran the campaigns. And when we look at it, that's where we are. So as we're looking into 2024, those are the things that we have to look at on the campaign side as a guy that runs campaigns. What does that mean on how do we need to get things on the ballot, whether it's a legislative referral or other things, because there's a workforce issue and a dollars issue that we're having to face, whether it's here in Montana or any of the other 13 or 14 states that do ballot initiatives.
Great. Thanks, Mark. So before we came out, Jesse, you made a comment that was really insightful with regard to ballot initiatives and the process and the importance of striking a balance between people's rights to get issues before voters as well as creating a predictable business environment. And with that, why do we need ballot measure reform in Montana?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's a great point. Ballot reform, I think when you say those words, it's a little scary to some individuals. They think, oh my gosh, they're going to try to prevent our right to bring laws by initiative. And I don't think that that is the goal at all. I think that, the chamber is being very thoughtful in trying to strike that balance and trying to get it right, because the business community also brings ballot initiatives at times as well. So there is a balance to be struck, and I think that that's really where we're going. I would say that we need ballot measure reform in Montana for a couple reasons. I think over the last couple decades, we've been seeing a few different trends, one of which is some folks bring initiatives to ban a particular type of business. So if you don't have, the most socially acceptable or trendy business model, you could see yourself facing a ballot initiative. We saw it where Montanans banned cyanide leach mining. We saw it where Montanans banned game farms, payday and title lenders. Those are all initiatives that passed in these states and put real people out of business. So all of their employees had to find new jobs. These folks that had invested, their life's work into certain businesses were just done with, a vote at a ballot box. So that's a really scary proposition. I also think that in certain political environments, if you don't have the political will or a good enough policy to make it through the legislature, perhaps one of your only options is to then seek those policies through the ballot box. And a lot of times what you're doing is you're polling a message, a 30-second sexy soundbite that you can sell to a voter, and you decide to run an initiative on it. And that doesn't always make the most sound policy. There's not a lot of opportunity in the current review process to, thoughtfully consider what the policy is actually doing and whether that is the right policy for the state, what the broader policy implications are. It's really, can you win that 30-second soundbite? Can you sell this over the airwaves through mail pieces, et cetera? Because it's not a normal policy discussion. It is a campaign at that point. And so you're spending a whole lot of money and a whole lot of effort trying to explain why your business is valid and you should get to stay in business. And basically, if you're explaining during a ballot initiative campaign, you are losing.
Well, and I would say to that, and I challenge all of you to think of your individual voting habits. And again, we run a lot of ballot measures, mostly on the no side. Think of your own voting habits and how you vote on ballot measures. And by and large, if you don't understand it or you are confused, by and large, you are likely to vote no. If you look at it and go, man, this seems too good to be true. There's no way this is a good idea. It's going to be bad for business, or it's written poorly, as often sometimes they are. You're likely to vote no. When I'm running yes measures, which happens every so often, really we have to look at it, and I have to earn your vote. Because I have to figure out how to explain without losing, as Jesse just said, and I use that phrase all the time, but how do we get out in front of that and make you understand that this is a good idea? I have to earn that vote. If I'm running a no vote, or if I'm working to try to stop a ballot initiative before it gets there, and I had the opportunity to work on your behalf and on the chamber's behalf on CI 121 this past year, and working to keep that off the ballot, making that look like, okay, how is this really a good idea? And here's why. And I look at it from a casting doubt perspective. And I'm the guy that's doing the mailers and the TV and the radio and all of those things. And that's what I do. But my job is to win. Whether I'm passing something, whether I'm working to defeat a ballot initiative for one of our clients. But my job is to defeat it. Then I'll kick it over to Jesse. Jesse then will go work and get it through the legislative process and have those good ideas debated and worked through and things of that nature from a lobby side. But the ballot measure, it's really hard to pass something. And that's why when you're looking at the polling on those thresholds, we want to have it at 60, 62, 65% on a yes side, because there's going to be an erosion on it. If you start and you're running a yes campaign and your polling's at 50 or 52, I'm going to look at you and say, don't waste your money. Let's rewrite this. Let's look at something different, because it's going to be incredibly difficult to get that across the finish line on a ballot measure, whether that's here in Montana or anywhere else.
And Mark, you cover a wide geography in your work, and as evidenced last night at dinner, the number of planes that you fly on in any given year. What have you seen in other states in terms of harmful ballot initiatives, and what do those states do to protect itself against anti-business measures?
Well, there's a lot, and Montana is no stranger to those as you see in other states. Colorado is often ground zero. It's the last one to get on up until 2016. A lot of them were constitutional ballot measures because they had the same threshold as statutory measures. But just a couple of examples. 2018, there was a ballot measure in Colorado that made it all the way to the ballot. We worked to kill it. That would have all but shut down the oil and natural gas industry in Colorado. It would have done a 2,500-foot setback from schools, rivers, parks, streams, riparian areas. There was about a list of 40 or 50 different things, and when you overlaid it, it shut down 85% of the entire state, and in the top 5 producing counties for oil and gas, it shut down 97.5% of production in the state. So it would have all but shut down the oil and natural gas industry in Colorado, which would have been absolutely devastating. Also, we've had, in Colorado, we've done minimum wage is written into our Constitution. We just reintroduced gray wolves in Colorado. So good job, voters, on that one. That one was a frustrating one. But also things you've seen, there's been predatory lending attacks in Arizona. There's been oil and gas and a lot of natural resource attacks in Alaska, believe it or not. And I look at this, and a lot of these, as Jesse mentioned, they can't get it through the legislative process. So the opposition and those that are opposed to some of these things, doesn't matter if it's natural resources or any other topic, and I do a lot of natural resources work, they're going to go to the ballot and they're going to try to make that change at the ballot. And you see that time and time again, and those measures are incredibly expensive. I mean, we're talking tens of millions of dollars were spent in Colorado on those measures that I mentioned. Also in Alaska on trying to protect that. And if they shut down the oil and gas industry in Alaska, that represents 75% of the state's budget. The state then no longer has a budget because it has been solely dependent on oil and gas revenue over the last decades. So those are the things that we're seeing, and they just continue to pop up, and it's whack-a-mole. If you remember the old arcade game and you just keep beating it back, that's what these ballot measures are. They just keep popping up, whether they're here or anywhere else in the 13 or 14 states that do ballot initiatives. And business and you all and your peers in other states have to continue to fight back on that. And that's why some of the changes and looking at it, not that we want to stop it, make it just a little bit harder and put some transparency and some accountability on it, making it a little more difficult will make this process so much easier.
Yeah, and to Mark's point, I mean, I think a trend that you see in Montana a lot of times is not every state allows for ballot initiatives. So the folks that run ballot initiatives know what the states are that allow them. They know how to qualify them. So you'll see one idea that pops up in a certain state, and then you'll see a well-funded individual or group take that idea to every single other state where they think they have good enough polling and try to implement that idea. So it's really not necessarily always actual Montana citizen initiatives. It's an out-of-state entity or individual that is well-funded enough to come into Montana, find a Montanan, and then run an initiative.
And a lot of what you see, and of those 34 measures that were introduced this past time in Montana, the 151 that were introduced in Colorado, they're title shopping. So I'm going to introduce 10, 15, 20 different things. I'm going to change an to a than. I'm going to change an it to an or. And we're going to see if I get different title and what that comes out with, because that's what people read. Show of hands, how many of you read your blue book or your book on your
voter information pamphlet?
Your voter information pamphlet. I call it the blue book. All right. Congratulations, you are not the norm. The general public is going to open their ballot and they're going to get into their polling booth and they're going to look at it and they're going to vote based on what's written there. They're not going to read the pros and cons that are in the voter information pamphlet that is sent out in advance of the election. They're going to base it on that. So we've got to get that correct. And that's when you're looking at it on the polling and on that research of, okay, what is the language that we have here and how do we get that exactly right? And if I'm on the no side, and we can do this in Colorado and some other states before the title board, can we challenge it? Can we make that title confusing to read? As I mentioned earlier on having that confusing and concerning to look at. How do we make that more difficult so people kind of pause and go, is this really a good idea? I know you have the fiscal impact statements here in Montana on ballot initiatives, and those have been some of the changes that have come over the last several years that really work to provide that information for those that aren't going to read that voter information guide that you all read, and everyone should read, but we know that isn't always the case. So some of those changes are really good opportunities, and there's a lot more that can be done.
And no offense, but we don't want to be Colorado. I mean, 34 is
None taken.
34 is a lot. And every time someone drops one of these initiatives, this takes your taxpayer dollars to review it. So you're taking away from all of the existing duties of those 3 offices that I mentioned. They have these duties to review these in addition to. So when you have the state make that investment and that expenditure in reviewing these, that's a use of state resources. And part of what we're trying to do is just ensure that that is a good use of those resources. And if folks are submitting initiatives, they've put some of this thought and effort into the initiative in advance before submitting it. So we're not just making the Secretary of State and Legislative Services and the Attorney General review 5 different initiatives all on the same topic with 1 or 2 different words. That's a bad use of resources, in my opinion.
For the record, everyone that I talk to in the other states I work in admit that they don't want their state to become Colorado either, so you're not unique in that regard.
So that's actually a perfect segue to this next question and to allow us to pivot back to reform. But Jesse, why is now the time that it's important to address reform and modernization of ballot measures, and what might be some of the anti-business measures that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, I think now is a really good time to look at this. The initiatives, the right to pass laws by citizen initiative was enacted in the 1972 Constitution, and then the process was put into place in a little more detail in statute, and it honestly has not really changed much since that time. I would say that last session there was one piece of legislation that looked at making some reforms to allow a little bit more public participation into the process, a little bit more review to ensure we were getting some good policy out of these initiatives. And that's really been the first time in my career that I've seen any sort of change to the process. Just to raise that bar a little bit, I think would be appropriate at this time, just because we're seeing a trend of more and more initiatives getting dropped every election cycle than we have in the past. It's really kind of increased. It's using those state resources. For example, this cycle there were 34 initiatives that were dropped into the review process, made it partway through the process. Only 4 of those made it all the way through the process, and 2 of the 4 took original proceedings to the Montana Supreme Court because they disagreed with the Attorney General review. So prosecuting an original proceeding in front of the Montana Supreme Court and then the state having to defend that is another huge, use of state resources, and it all has to be done in a very truncated time frame. So I think we're just seeing a lot more. I also know, being a lobbyist, that once an initiative is passed by the citizenry, that the legislature has a difficult time convincing itself that it can make tweaks and edits to what the citizens passed. And I will go back to my prior comment that this is not always the most well thought out best policy for the state. And so just allowing some more points into the process where you get public participation and feedback, and you get to talk about what the actual implications of these measures are, I think is important. I also think, given our current political climate, that we're going to see a lot of anti-business measures coming forward. I think the legislature is going to be an inhospitable place to certain types of ideas, and I think that we will see a lot more folks try ballot initiatives to try to get their primary goals through the process. And ballot measures are not good for business. I mean, a lot of times folks can plan on their budgets, like how much money they want to spend on PR, how much money they want to spend on lobbyists, on legal, on all these different things. And all of a sudden you wake up one morning and there's a ballot initiative to put you out of business. And you're going to have to raise $500,000 to try to prevent that from making it to the ballot. And then if it's a really, well polling idea and it makes it to the ballot, it qualifies, you're looking in the millions of dollars range to try to kill this initiative. So back pre-COVID, I think it was 2018 cycle, there was an initiative, I-186 in Montana, that would have put the mining industry in the state out of business. They had to spend over $5 million to kill that once it landed on the ballot. There was another initiative, I-185, that was a twofold, but increased taxes for a certain segment. And there was tens of millions of dollars put into that initiative to prevent it from passing once it was on the ballot. The two initiatives this cycle that were anti-business, CI 121 and I-191, I think the groups collectively spent about $500,000 to prevent them from being qualified, which was a huge win. Otherwise, I think these groups would have been in the $10 million range to keep them from passing on the ballot.
So, Mark, what reforms have you seen other states make or attempt to make, and were they successful?
Yeah, and Jesse's right. In Montana and in most of these states, all of these got written into the Constitution when, at statehood of direct ballot access and direct democracy. And a lot of them haven't been changed since then. Things have changed. Colorado's was written in 1876. It hadn't been changed for ballot measures perspective for well over 130, 140 years. There's been, and every state's a little different, and a couple of on just how to qualify things for the ballot. Two of my favorites that are interesting before I talk about some of the reforms. One of them is in Alaska, that the signatures are due the day the legislature gavels into session in an even year. So today, if we were in Alaska, session's in, for the fall election, they would have had to have already collected the signatures for a ballot that's going to be on there. So you've got 11 months of runway to know what's going on. But then the legislature also knows, and they can do some things to try to preempt that. The second one, and the one that I always find entertaining, which is why they never run ballot measures in Nevada, is Nevada requires that you pass a ballot initiative, the exact same measure, in 2 consecutive elections. So you have to run a campaign, say we're going to run a campaign in 2022, pass it. You then have to run that exact same campaign and get it passed in 2024. So you've more than doubled, if not almost tripled, your campaign costs on that. So when we're talking about, people are like, well, why don't we do that? It sounded really good when Nevada became a state, and it's really good because they got it locked in there. There is no way that we could get that across now to do 2 consecutive elections. That's a bridge too far. But some of the things that we've seen, and some of the ones that I've worked on, in 2016, we passed, and Jesse used the phrase on raising the bar. That was the tagline for our campaign for Amendment 71, which was to raise the bar. In Colorado, we had our Constitution ballot measures and our state statute ballot measures had the exact same threshold for signature collection and the exact same threshold for passage. So you needed to get 5% of the Secretary of State vote from the previous election, average right now it's about 125,000 valid signatures, really easy in Colorado. And you did not have a geographical distribution requirement at all. And you could pass it with just half plus one vote. So that's why the Colorado Constitution's been amended 137 times to the U.S. Constitution's 27. So we looked at it, and a lot of the business community said, okay, we got to change this. We tried to do it both, and looked at it both constitutionally and statutorily, and the Constitution one was the one that we knew we could get across. So we took it, and there's now a geographical distribution requirement requiring signatures from every state Senate district across Colorado. So of the number that you need, 2% has to come from every district, from all of our state Senate districts in all 4 corners of the state, which is great because the rural communities are now not left out. They do not rely on the I-25 corridor only to collect signatures. And also to amend the Constitution, it's at a 55% threshold, which is huge, and it makes, to Jesse's point on raising the bar, just a little more difficult. It's not overly cumbersome. It's not 60, it's not 65%. I've had clients that have said that they want to pass something that, make it 60 or 65%, and the voters will vote that down. They want to have the right to put things on the ballot and vote on them, but they don't think that a simple majority is the right way. A couple of other quick examples, 2 specifically in Arizona that were just passed this year. One of them on single subject. Up until that point, you could have a Christmas tree bill in as a ballot measure and have 10 or 15 different topics on it. They passed a single subject reform. It was referred out by the legislature at the direction of now former Governor Ducey in Arizona. And also they passed requiring that tax bills pass at 60%. And so getting that threshold up, if they wanted to have something passed and a tax measure passed through a citizen reform, they had to have a supermajority at 60%. So those are a couple that we've seen. There's been a lot of this discussion around the country on some of these harmful measures that have really started to come up. So I know Montana is not alone when it's looking at what needs to be done with ballot measure reform and how do we need to update and modernize some of these laws that are out there that we are so very concerned of, because you end up with really bad precedent that then has to be litigated in court or other things. One other one that's difficult for business, but that Jesse mentioned also in Arizona, and they passed this about 10 years ago. If you pass a ballot initiative in Arizona, the legislature can, by law, cannot amend it except to further the purpose and cause of the ballot initiative. So if there's an anti-business measure and it gets passed, the legislature can do nothing about it unless it takes whatever was passed and goes farther and bolsters that and makes that stronger. They're not able to repeal it. They're not able to make changes on it. So there's been some things that have cut both ways over the years.
And that particular initiative was actually submitted 3 times with slightly different words in this cycle.
And Jesse, it all started about an hour and a half ago with the swearing in at the Capitol, so it's going to be go time very quickly. Are you working with others on some of these reforms?
Yeah, the Chamber is leading the effort on, the update and modernization of the ballot initiative review process, but we're doing this as part of a stakeholder group. CI 121 dealt with, a California property tax initiative that was being brought into Montana, and I-191 was a change to water laws that would have resulted in a moratorium on development in certain regions of the state. And while those two topics and subjects seem very far apart, they actually resulted in almost the exact same group of opponents from the business community. So several different business industry sectors, as well as the Chamber, were part of those opposition coalitions that helped keep those bad initiatives off the ballot this cycle. So we've reached out to our partners that helped oppose those efforts and asked their interest in looking at some of these updates, and that stakeholder group has pretty much hung together, and we continue to be, broad-based and thoughtful, and folks that we're asking to join us on this effort.
And I think it's nice to see, and as a guy that runs, these campaigns and coalitions, that they actually did stick together. Most of the time, the Wednesday after the election at about noon or 1 o'clock, we all kind of come together and look and recover from the previous night when we've all been out. And look and go, okay, well, we won. It's great. We're able to move on, and we shake hands and we move on. The good thing with this is there's been a lot of expenditures of not only dollars but of time. And I can't count the amount of hours that we spent on 121 with that coalition working on your behalf with the greater business community, and I know 191 as well. But there's been work that has happened since July when we were able to keep these off, and continuing that and not letting that go by the wayside is so critical. And my call to action to you, one of them as we're chatting today and conversations that I have with business leaders around the country is continue to drive those discussions and do not let them stop just because we won. Do not let them stop just because the legislature gavelled out of session and you've got 18 months to kind of take a reprieve and a breather on this here. There are things that need to be done. There's opportunities and ways that we can look at things to make this easier going down the long haul instead of, as Jesse mentioned, waking up one morning and there's a ballot measure and we've got to scramble. Those are always going to happen, but what infrastructure can be put in place? What work can be done prior to make sure that, okay, if something happens, it becomes a little more turnkey than scrambling around, because a lot of this becomes very methodical and very mechanical, that we're able to do different things and get all of this set up very, very quickly.
And this is the last question, but I'd ask you both to address it, but it kind of steps off that point, Mark. What do you need from the business community in terms of, as the chamber works through some of these issues? And go, Jesse.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark said it. Mark said it pretty well. We just are asking you to remain engaged. Would love any thoughts, feedback, personal experience. I'm going to give a little plug for the Chamber. The Chamber has been very forward-thinking, thanks in large part to Todd, and is working on setting up a fund to help businesses fight these ballot initiatives as they come up, so doing some general fundraising for that. So if anybody has a few extra dollars laying around and wants to give them to Todd for these eventual efforts that we know we'll see coming, he's in the back, you can talk to him. But we see the writing on the wall and just want you all to continue to be our partners and share your voices with us and share your voices with the legislature and let them know that this is an important issue to you all as well.
And I would build on that. I know we were chatting at supper last evening on a number of the individual ballot measures that have attacked specific business, whether it's oil and gas, coal, agriculture, a number of things, whether it's here or in other states. If you have examples, we need to know those as we're working through these. I would love to know these because this is not the only state that I'm working in on some changes to ballot measures. If you work in other states, if you've had attacks on this that you've had to fight, those examples really help to be able to bolster the argument as to why raising the bar ever so slightly is so very critically important. Not just here in Montana, but I know there's a lot of industry in the room that represents multiple states across our great country here. How are we able to see that and make those changes so that we can tell that story? And getting business to try to tell that story I know is often difficult, and it's one of the hardest parts of my job is being able to tell that, because you guys are busy running your business. Let me help tell that story. Let Jesse help tell that story so we can go to the members of the legislature and say, this is why we need to make these changes. And a lot of the work here in Montana, it's great. These reforms aren't going to have to go to a ballot measure. In a lot of other states, like Colorado and Arizona, they have to go to a ballot measure because in order to do it, we have to amend the Constitution. There's no way around it, or we know that the legislature is going to throw up some of those roadblocks. So I think this is the beginning of the discussion as we're moving forward, not the end of it, even though we're 2 years away from an election. And somebody the other day brought up 2026, and I about wanted to throw them across the room. I'm like, I'm not ready to talk about 2026 yet. Not there yet. Let's get through session, and then we can get into 2024 and beyond. But we need to start having these conversations now.
Great. Well, we had a secondary goal of not getting between you and the break. I think we're 5 minutes early, but I'd first like to thank Jesse and Mark for their time today and really sharing their insights and perspectives on this really important issue. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Paul's right. We've got 30 minutes now. We'll get back together about 2:30. I'll call you about 2:25. I encourage you to take the time to engage in some interesting conversations and get beyond the weather with all the folks in the room. So enjoy the networking break.